The laughter rolled through the high-ceiling ballroom like champagne bubbles, light and careless, but each burst of sound cut into her like glass. The Winter Haven Charity Gala was the kind of place where the city's elite came to preen. Golden light from crystal chandeliers, tables weighed down by orchids and silver, a string quartet in the corner. Money dripped from every corner of the room, and so did gossip. And tonight, the juiciest gossip in the room was standing under the spotlight, holding court like a king. Adrian Hale, her ex-husband, tall, broad-shouldered, with that easy arrogance that made people lean in when he spoke. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his tuxedo tailored to perfection. But it wasn't his polished appearance that had the room hanging on his every word. It was the woman on his arm. Sienna Reed, 27, model turned lifestyle influencer, a living advertisement for champagne breakfasts and weekend yacht trips. Her red silk gown clung to her like a second skin, the kind of dress designed to make women stare and men forget their wives. Sienna's laughter was high and sharp, carrying just enough to turn heads. And when she tried to pronounce Coco Van, she said it like Cock and Van. Adrian finished his story with a smirk, prompting a round of laughter from the men standing in their little semicircle of self-importance. It didn't take much imagination to know who she was in the story, his ex-wife. Madeline Archer stood just a few feet away, unseen in the crowd, her champagne untouched in her hand. She hadn't planned on being here tonight. The gala had been a last-minute addition to her schedule, at the insistence of a friend who claimed she needed to be seen. She hadn't expected him to be here, not after the divorce had been finalized just 9 months ago. But there he was, acting as though he'd won some kind of cosmic prize by trading her in for someone younger, flashier, and far more willing to be an accessory to his ego. She remembered that smirk, the one he wore now as Sienna clung to his arm like a diamond bracelet. It was the same smirk he'd worn the day he'd told her he needed a partner who could keep up. Translation: someone who made him look good in photographs. Madeline's jaw tightened, but her expression remained calm. She'd mastered that over the years, the art of letting him think his words didn't cut deep. It was a skill that had kept her dignity intact through every cruel comment, every late-night business dinner, every carefully calculated moment designed to remind her she was replaceable. The truth was, she had been replaceable in his world. But the part Adrian didn't know, couldn't possibly imagine, was that her world had changed dramatically since the ink had dried on their divorce papers. Across the ballroom, Adrian leaned in closer to his audience, lowering his voice just enough to make them lean in. Beauty like Sienna's, that's not something you can buy. She's the kind of woman you fight for. Some women, he shrugged, letting the implication hang, they just fade into the background. The men chuckled. Sienna giggled like she was in on a delicious secret. Madeline didn't move. She let her gaze drift away from him, taking in the glittering crowd, the clink of crystal, the rustle of expensive fabrics. She could have walked out right then. She could have spared herself the ache in her chest, the sour taste in her mouth. But she stayed. Because Madeline wasn't the same woman who'd cried herself to sleep in the master bedroom of their glass-walled penthouse while Adrian stayed late at the office. She wasn't the same woman who'd watched her savings dwindle after the divorce settlement, wondering how she'd rebuild. She wasn't the same woman who'd let him decide her worth. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. She slipped it out and glanced at the screen. A single message from the man who had been changing her life for the past 6 months. Almost there, ready to make our entrance? Her lips curved into the faintest smile. She typed back one word: always. No one here knew about him, not yet. Not the society wives who'd whispered about her fall from grace. Not the men who looked past her like she was invisible. And certainly not Adrian Hale. And that was exactly how she wanted it. She slipped her phone back into her bag and glanced toward the entrance of the ballroom. The doorman stood at attention, his gloved hand resting on the brass handle. Beyond those doors, her future was walking toward her in a tailored midnight suit, a man whose name could make boardrooms go silent. The music swelled as the string quartet shifted into a new piece. Adrian's laughter carried over the crowd again. "You just can't fake class," he was saying, his hand resting on the curve of Sienna's hip. Madeline took a slow breath, her pulse steady, her spine straight. She'd let him finish his little performance. She'd let him feel like the king of the room for just a few more minutes. Because when the doors opened, everything would change. The moment her companion stepped inside, every head would turn, and Adrian Hale's smirk would disappear forever. Madeline Archer had not been born into the shimmering world of gala dinners and champagne toasts. Her beginnings were humble, modest even, rooted in the warmth of a small-town life in Willow Creek, Pennsylvania. Her father ran a little hardware store on Main Street, the kind where he knew every customer by name. Her mother, a schoolteacher, poured her heart into her students, often staying late to help the ones who struggled most. It was the kind of childhood built on the currency of trust and hard work, not money or social status. Summers were sticky with the scent of fresh-cut grass and sweet tea. Winters were small-town festivals, handmade quilts raffled off for charity, and neighbors shoveling each other's driveways without being asked. Madeline grew up with the quiet certainty that kindness mattered. She never imagined those values could be used against her, until she met Adrian Hale. She had moved to New York at 22, fresh out of college with a degree in interior architecture and a portfolio brimming with ideas. The city was overwhelming at first. Glass towers scraping the sky, streets buzzing with the urgency of people chasing their dreams. She rented a cramped studio above a noisy bodega, living on instant noodles and sheer determination. Her big break came when she landed a junior position at Whitmore Designs, one of the city's most respected interior firms. She poured herself into every project, often staying late to perfect mood boards and spatial layouts. It was during one of those long nights that Adrian walked in. At the time, Adrian was a rising star in real estate development. Charming, ambitious, and with just enough edge to make people believe he'd stop at nothing to win. He'd hired Whitmore Designs for a boutique hotel renovation, and Madeline had been assigned to prepare preliminary concepts for his review. She remembered the first meeting vividly, the way he'd leaned over the table to look at her sketches, the glint of approval in his dark eyes, the half-smile that felt like a secret. He'd asked her about her vision for the space, and instead of the polite nods she was used to from clients, Adrian had listened. Really listened. Or so she thought. Over the next 6 months, their professional interactions blurred into personal ones. Coffee meetings turned into late-night dinners. He made her feel seen in a city that often made her feel invisible. When he told her he admired her groundedness and fresh perspective, she believed him. By 24, she was his wife. The early years of their marriage were a whirlwind. Adrian's career exploded, moving him from the fringes of the city's elite to the very center. Magazine spreads, speaking engagements, private yacht parties. Madeline found herself in rooms she had once only seen in glossy pages. But with each new level of success, Adrian changed. At first, it was subtle, a critical remark about a dress she wore to a dinner, a suggestion that she polish up for photographs. Then came the unspoken rules, what she could say in front of investors, how she should greet certain wives, the expectation that she'd be available for every event, no matter how last minute. Madeline adjusted. She told herself this was just part of loving a man like Adrian. She thought if she could just keep up, he would still see her the way he once had. But the truth was, Adrian no longer wanted the woman from Willow Creek who spoke her mind and laughed too loudly at bad jokes. He wanted a fixture, an ornament, a silent testament to his success. She began to fade into the role he had scripted for her. Poised, agreeable, decorative. The breaking point came on their 5th anniversary. Adrian had thrown a lavish party at their penthouse, inviting half the city's power players. That night she overheard him in the study, speaking to a friend over the clink of ice in a glass. "She's fine," he'd said. "But you know how it is. In my world, image is everything. I need someone who turns heads." Madeline stood frozen in the hallway, his words sinking into her like ice water. That was the moment she realized she had become invisible to him. Not because she wasn't enough, but because he couldn't see beyond his own ego. The divorce, when it came 2 years later, was as cold and calculated as one of his real estate deals. The settlement was fair on paper, but Adrian made sure it was clear to their circle that he had moved on, while she had been left behind. And that's exactly how the city saw her. The ex-wife who couldn't keep up. What they didn't know was that after the dust settled, Madeline had gone back to the one thing that had always been hers, her work. She took a senior role at a boutique design firm, her talent catching the attention of clients with deeper pockets and bigger visions than she'd ever dreamed possible. One of those clients was Nicholas Grant. At first, he was just another name on her project list, a reclusive billionaire known for his quiet philanthropy and his penchant for privacy. Their first meeting had been all business, but Madeline noticed the way his questions cut deeper than square footage and color palettes. He wanted to know why she chose certain textures, why she thought people felt at ease in a room she designed. Over the months that followed, their professional relationship evolved into something else, something steady, respectful, and quietly electric. Nicholas wasn't a man who needed to be the loudest voice in the room. He noticed details. He remembered small things she said in passing. He never made her feel like she had to compete for space. By the time he asked her to dinner 6 months after their first meeting, Madeline realized she'd been holding her breath since her marriage ended. With Nicholas, she could exhale. Now, as she stood in the Winter Haven ballroom, watching Adrian bask in his own self-importance, Madeline thought of the man who was about to walk through those doors. The man who had asked her, just last week, to marry him. She hadn't told anyone yet. Not her friends, not her colleagues, and certainly not her ex-husband. But in a few minutes, everyone would know. And Adrian Hale was about to find out in the most public way possible. The Winter Haven Charity Gala was the kind of event designed to make the rest of the city feel small. The moment you stepped into the ballroom of the Wexford Grand Hotel, the air changed, warmer, heavier, carrying the scent of rare orchids and aged champagne. The ceiling soared high above, painted with soft frescoes that shimmered under the light of 12 massive crystal chandeliers. Along the walls, gilded sconces threw a golden glow over everything, softening the sharp edges of diamonds and the sharper edges of ambition. White-gloved servers moved like clockwork between tables draped in ivory satin, each one crowned with towering floral arrangements that seemed to defy gravity. The gala wasn't just about charity, it was a chessboard. Every conversation was a move, every glance a calculation. Old money mingled with new, boardroom titans shook hands with politicians, and somewhere in the mix, deals worth billions were whispered over amuse-bouches topped with caviar. Madeline had attended her fair share of these events during her marriage to Adrian. She knew the rhythm. Arrive fashionably late, circle the room with a practiced smile, exchange pleasantries with people who already knew your net worth, and leave with a pocket full of business cards you'd never use. Tonight felt different. For one thing, she wasn't on Adrian's arm. That alone changed the way people looked at her. Without the title of Mrs. Hale, she was no longer part of the package people wanted to photograph. Some greeted her with polite surprise, others with the thin-lipped sympathy reserved for those who'd lost their place in the social hierarchy. She let them think whatever they wanted. Madeline wore a floor-length gown of deep emerald silk, the color making her skin glow under the warm light. The neckline was elegant but daring enough to draw the eye, and the subtle sweep of her hair revealed a pair of diamond drop earrings, her only visible nod to extravagance. The rest of her confidence came from within, and it showed in the way she moved through the room. On the far side of the ballroom, Adrian was in his element. He and Sienna had positioned themselves near the champagne fountain, a prime location for visibility. Madeline noticed the way Sienna kept adjusting her posture whenever someone approached, turning just enough to showcase her dress's dramatic open back. Adrian, meanwhile, was playing host without actually hosting. He clasped hands, shared quick stories, laughed at just the right moments. His voice carried, by design, so that even those across the room could catch snippets of his conversation. Beauty like hers, Madeline heard him say to a silver-haired financier, isn't just luck, it's art. His gaze slid over Sienna like she was a prized exhibit. And I appreciate art. Madeline didn't flinch. She'd learned long ago that men like Adrian thrived on reaction. Instead, she let her eyes wander to the grand staircase at the far end of the room. Guests entered there, descending the wide marble steps under a sweeping crystal chandelier. She knew Nicholas would be walking down those steps in minutes. Until then, she busied herself with the game of the evening, small talk with people she hadn't seen in months. Some approached with genuine warmth, remembering her work with the city's design council. Others came out of curiosity, their eyes flicking toward Adrian before settling on her. "So good to see you out, Madeline," one woman cooed, her pearls gleaming against her collarbone. "You must be keeping busy." "Very," Madeline replied, her smile polite but unreadable. From her position, she had a clear view of Adrian. He looked relaxed, too relaxed. She could tell he thought he'd already won whatever unspoken contest he believed existed between them. He had the younger woman, the designer tux, the spotlight. That was fine. Let him feel untouchable. The string quartet shifted into a smooth, rich melody that made the air feel like velvet. A murmur rippled through the crowd near the staircase. Madeline's heart gave one sharp, steady beat. Nicholas Grant had arrived. Even before she saw him, she could feel the subtle shift in the room. Conversations paused, heads turned, not out of rudeness, but because Nicholas carried the kind of presence that demanded attention without asking for it. He appeared at the top of the staircase, tall and impeccably dressed in a midnight suit tailored within an inch of perfection. His dark hair was swept back, his posture unshakably composed. Beside him, an older gentleman, his longtime business advisor, nodded to a few familiar faces in the crowd. But Nicholas's gaze wasn't on anyone else. It was fixed on her. The connection was instant and visible. Anyone watching could see the way his expression softened when their eyes met, the way his steps became just slightly quicker as he descended toward her. Madeline felt every set of eyes tracking the moment. Adrian noticed too. She saw the flicker of confusion cross his face, the faint furrow between his brows. He turned slightly, as if to get a better look at the man commanding so much attention. Nicholas reached her and offered his hand, not a casual handshake, but something deliberate, grounded. "You look incredible," he said in a low voice meant only for her. "Thank you," she replied, her fingers resting lightly in his. "Shall we?" His gaze flicked toward the champagne fountain, toward Adrian. It wasn't a challenge, it was an inevitability. She nodded once. As they began walking together, a quiet ripple moved through the crowd. Conversations slowed. Cameras, both official and discreet, shifted in their direction. The music, the lighting, the opulence of the room all seemed to frame them as they moved. Adrian's posture straightened. Sienna's smile faltered. Madeline's heart was steady now. Whatever came next, she knew the balance of the room had already shifted. And the man who had once dismissed her as background noise was about to find himself in the shadow of someone far greater. Adrian Hale had always been a man who thrived in the spotlight. From the moment he set foot in New York fresh out of business school, he'd been chasing that intoxicating blend of wealth, influence, and recognition. In his mind, success wasn't just measured in profit margins. It was measured in how many heads turned when he walked into a room. He'd come from nothing, or so he liked to say, spinning his early years into a rags-to-riches narrative that made investors feel good about backing him. In truth, his upbringing had been comfortably middle class, no silver spoon, but no real hardship either. He'd never known hunger, never had to choose between paying the rent and keeping the lights on. But self-made sounded better on magazine covers, and Adrian was a master of shaping perception. In his 20s, he'd burned through jobs quickly, not because he lacked talent, but because he refused to work for anyone he couldn't eventually outshine. Real estate became his arena. He had a knack for identifying undervalued properties, flipping them into luxury spaces, and selling them to the kind of people who didn't blink at 8-figure price tags. The charm helped. Adrian could walk into a room of strangers and walk out with 3 new allies, 2 potential deals, and someone else picking up the check. He could talk about architecture with a designer, sports cars with a hedge fund manager, and vintage wine with a collector, all in the same evening. But behind the charm was a relentless hunger for validation. The bigger the deal, the more extravagant the purchase, the more beautiful the woman on his arm, the more he believed he mattered. When he met Madeline, he had been drawn to her in a way that surprised him. She wasn't chasing him. She wasn't impressed by the watch on his wrist or the car he drove. At the time, her refusal to play the game had intrigued him. He told himself she grounded him, made him better. But as his career skyrocketed, the novelty wore off. The circles he moved in valued image above all else. And Adrian began to see Madeline not as the woman who supported him through long nights and tight deadlines, but as an accessory that no longer matched the lifestyle he envisioned. He never admitted it aloud, but he wanted more, or rather different. Someone who would amplify his presence, not compete with it. Enter Sienna Reed. He'd met her at a private yacht party hosted by a tech billionaire. Sienna had been there as a guest of a fashion photographer, her social media following already in the millions. She was all shimmer and sharp edges, the kind of woman who understood the value of being photographed in the right place, with the right people, at the right time. Adrian saw opportunity. Sienna saw the same. Within weeks, she was on his arm at industry events, her face appearing alongside his in gossip columns. She knew how to pose, how to laugh at just the right volume, how to wear something that would be talked about the next day. With Sienna, Adrian felt like he'd leveled up. She fed his ego in a way Madeline never would. And when the whispers about his failing marriage grew louder, Sienna became both the excuse and the prize. The divorce from Madeline had been clean, legally speaking. Emotionally, Adrian had treated it like a business transaction. He assumed she'd quietly fade into a smaller life, perhaps move back to her hometown. He even told a friend once, over a $600 bottle of wine, "She's not cut out for this city without me." That's why tonight, he was so comfortable. From his vantage point near the champagne fountain, he could see nearly the whole ballroom. He was aware of who was watching him, aware of the cameras capturing his interactions. Sienna was draped over his arm like a designer scarf, her smile calculated, her body language angled for maximum visual impact. When he spotted Madeline earlier, standing alone near the center of the room, he'd felt a brief spark of satisfaction. She looked good, of course, she always had, but he told himself she looked smaller, quieter, like someone trying to blend in. Perfect, he thought. This was the confirmation he'd been waiting for, that he'd been right to move on. He even allowed himself a little performance, telling a story within earshot of others about women who fade into the background and how beauty like Sienna's was worth fighting for. He knew Madeline would hear it. He wanted her to. But now, something was off. The shift in the room was subtle at first, but Adrian had been in enough high-stakes negotiations to recognize it. People's attention was moving. Not toward him, but toward the grand staircase. A name buzzed faintly in the air, passed in murmurs. And then he saw him. Nicholas Grant. Adrian knew of him, of course. Everyone in their world did. Billionaire investor, private equity king, philanthropist with a reputation for keeping a low profile. The man avoided publicity so effectively that sightings of him at public events were rare enough to make headlines. Which begged the question, what was Nicholas Grant doing at the Winter Heaven Gala? Adrian's gaze followed Nicholas's descent down the staircase and stopped cold when he realized where the man's attention was fixed. On Madeline. She wasn't standing off to the side anymore. She was moving toward Nicholas with a poise that made heads turn in her wake. The emerald silk of her gown caught the light like it had been designed for this very room. And when Nicholas reached her, he took her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world, like they'd done it 1,000 times before. Adrian's jaw tightened. Sienna shifted beside him, her smile wobbling. "Do you know him?" she whispered. Adrian didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on Madeline and Nicholas as they began walking, together, toward the champagne fountain. The crowd was watching now. Conversation stilled, cameras lifted, and for the first time in a very long time, Adrian Hale felt something he didn't like. Not confusion, not irritation, fear. Because if Nicholas Grant was here for Madeline, then everything Adrian thought he knew about his ex-wife and his place in this city was about to be rewritten. The ballroom had shifted into a strange, suspended state, like the moment before a summer storm breaks. Conversations were quieter now, eyes following Madeline and Nicholas as they crossed the floor together. The music played on, but even the string quartet seemed to sense the tension brewing beneath the surface. Madeline felt the weight of 100 gazes, but her steps never faltered. Nicholas walked beside her, his presence steady, his expression unreadable except for the faintest shadow of amusement tugging at the corner of his mouth. He didn't need to put his hand at her back or make a show of guiding her. His nearness was enough to make the room part for them. They reached the champagne fountain where Adrian stood with Sienna, still in prime position as though he owned the evening. But now, the attention that had once orbited around him was being siphoned away, and everyone, including Adrian, knew it. Nicholas extended a hand toward the table. "Champagne?" Madeline nodded, accepting a crystal flute from him. Her fingers brushed his briefly, and though the gesture was subtle, it was enough to send a whisper rippling through the crowd. "They're together." "Madeline," Adrian said finally, his voice warm on the surface but edged with steel. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." She met his gaze evenly. "I could say the same, Adrian." Sienna shifted, her hand tightening possessively on Adrian's arm. "We're here for the charity auction," she offered, her tone laced with that particular brand of sweetness reserved for rivals. "Adrian's a big supporter of the cause." Nicholas's eyes flicked to Sienna, then back to Adrian. "I'm sure he is." His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent there, something that made Sienna's smile falter. Adrian's attention snapped back to Madeline. "So, you and Grant know each other?" Madeline took a slow sip of champagne before answering. "We do. Quite well, actually." The way she said it was deliberate, polite, almost casual, but threaded with a confidence Adrian hadn't heard from her in years. "Interesting," Adrian said, though his jaw tightened. "How did that happen?" Nicholas stepped in before Madeline could answer. "Through her work. She's brilliant, by the way. Easily the most talented designer I've ever worked with." Madeline allowed herself the smallest smile. Compliments from Nicholas were never for show. He didn't deal in empty words. "Well," Sienna interjected, her laugh light but brittle. "Small world, isn't it?" Nicholas turned to Madeline. "Shall we find our table?" She nodded, and together they began to move past Adrian and Sienna. But just as they stepped away, a voice rang out from behind them. "Wait," Adrian said, louder now, drawing the attention of everyone within earshot. "Madeline, I'm just curious. Is this some kind of stunt?" The words hung in the air, heavy and cutting. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Madeline stopped. Slowly she turned back to face him. "A stunt?" Adrian shrugged, feigning nonchalance, though his eyes were sharp. "You show up at a gala you've never attended without me, on the arm of Nicholas Grant? Forgive me for thinking you might be trying to make a point." The corners of Nicholas's mouth tightened, not in the way a man does when he's deciding whether or not to dismantle someone in public. Madeline didn't give him the chance. "If I were trying to make a point, Adrian," she said, her voice calm but carrying just enough to be heard by the onlookers, "you wouldn't have to ask what it was." A few people nearby stifled their reactions. Sienna's eyes darted between them, sensing the shift. "We should probably—" But Adrian wasn't ready to retreat. "I just think it's surprising. You never seemed interested in this world without me." Nicholas's voice cut through the space between them, smooth but firm. "That's because you never gave her the chance to show you what she's capable of." For the first time that night, Adrian looked unsettled. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then tried a different tack. "Well, I'm glad you've found something to do." It was meant to sound dismissive, but it came out petty. Madeline tilted her head, regarding him for a long moment. "I didn't find something to do, Adrian. I built something, and I found someone who actually sees me." That last sentence landed like a stone dropped into still water, silent for a beat, then sending ripples through everyone who heard it. Nicholas stepped closer, not in aggression, but in quiet solidarity. "Come on," he said to Madeline. "We're holding up the line." They walked away, leaving Adrian standing there with Sienna's grip still clamped around his arm. As they made their way toward their table, Madeline could feel the stares trailing them. Some were curious, some envious, and a few, just a few, were approving. She knew she'd just shifted the narrative in that room, and she didn't regret it for a second. At their table, Nicholas pulled out her chair, and for the first time all evening, she let herself relax. But she knew this wasn't over. Adrian wasn't the type to let something like this pass quietly. She could already feel the next move coming. And she was ready for it. Because tonight wasn't about proving herself to Adrian. It was about reminding herself who she had always been. For a while after the champagne fountain encounter, Madeline felt steady. She had stood her ground, made her presence known, and walked away with her head high. But in a room like this, victories didn't go unchallenged for long. Adrian was never one to let the spotlight drift from him, especially if it meant someone else. Especially Madeline had claimed it. It began subtly. A whisper here, a lingering glance there. She noticed a woman she'd known for years approach their table, offer Nicholas a too bright smile, and then lean in to murmur something that made his brow furrow ever so slightly. The woman departed quickly, leaving behind an invisible trail of tension. Nicholas didn't mention it right away, but Madeline knew the look. She had seen it before on Adrian, right before he delivered bad news in the most public way possible. The evening rolled on. Dinner was served in courses that looked like art. Delicate towers of salmon, roasted quail with truffle sauce, petit fours painted with gold leaf. But Madeline barely tasted any of it. She could feel the shift in the air, a subtle recalibration that meant someone was maneuvering against her. When the charity auction began, Adrian made his move. The auctioneer rattled through the early items: a week in the Hamptons, dinner with a celebrity chef, front-row tickets to Fashion Week. Then came an unexpected lot. A design consultation and complete residential makeover, donated by Whitmore Designs, the very firm where Madeline had once worked before branching out on her own. Adrian raised his hand to bid. At first it seemed harmless, he could easily afford it, and maybe he just wanted to show off his generosity. But then, with a smirk that could slice glass, he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "We could use some help at our place. My fiancée's taste is exquisite, but you know how it is. Sometimes you have to start from scratch." The implication landed like a slap. He was rewriting the narrative again, painting her as the before picture, the outdated design that had to be replaced. People laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Nicholas's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Madeline put her hand lightly on his arm. She didn't want him to fight this battle for her. Not here, not now. Adrian won the auction item, of course, bidding an absurd amount that drew applause from those who didn't see the strings attached. He basked in it, leaning over to kiss Sienna's cheek as the cameras flashed. Madeline kept her composure until the auction ended. Then, excusing herself from the table, she stepped out into the hallway just beyond the ballroom. The air out here was cooler, quieter. She leaned against the wall, taking a slow breath. She hated that it still got to her, that Adrian still knew exactly where to aim. She'd rebuilt her life, found happiness again, and yet one public jab was enough to make old insecurities stir. She thought about the early days of their marriage, when she'd taken his opinions as truth, when a single offhand comment could send her changing outfits 3 times before an event. She had promised herself she'd never give him that kind of power again. And yet, here she was, heart racing, cheeks burning. "Madeline?" She turned to see Nicholas standing a few feet away, concern in his eyes. "You disappeared," he said. "I just needed some air," she admitted, "and some distance." He stepped closer. "You handled that with more grace than I would have. I wanted to call him out." She shook her head. "That's exactly what he wants, a public spat to turn the story into something messy. He thrives on it." Nicholas studied her for a moment, then said quietly, "Do you want to leave?" Part of her did, but another part, the part that had survived 2 years of being underestimated, refused. "No," she said finally, "not yet." They returned to the ballroom, but the mood had shifted. Whispers followed them. Madeline could feel eyes darting between her and Adrian's table, the unspoken question hovering in the air. Was he right? She smiled when necessary, but her energy was fading. Even the warmth of Nicholas's presence couldn't fully push away the sense of being back under Adrian's shadow. The final blow of the night came just before the gala ended. As guests began to gather their coats and say goodbyes, a photographer from one of the city's social columns approached. "Mind if we get a photo of the 4 of you together?" he asked brightly, glancing between Madeline, Nicholas, Adrian, and Sienna. Madeline froze. It was a trap, one that would be splashed across online headlines by morning. Exes reunite at gala. The image alone would be enough to spin any number of narratives, most of them unflattering to her. Nicholas looked at her, waiting for her cue. She almost declined. Almost. But before she could answer, Adrian stepped forward, arm around Sienna. "Of course," he said smoothly, "for old time's sake." The flash went off before she could react. Her stomach sank. She could already imagine the captions. Hale and his stunning fiancée pose alongside ex-wife. The visual contrast would be brutal. When the photo was done, she and Nicholas walked away without another word to Adrian. But the damage had been done. On the ride home, Madeline stared out the window of Nicholas's car, the city lights blurring past. "You're quiet," Nicholas said gently. She forced a small smile. "Just tired." But inside, she was replaying every second of the night, every calculated move Adrian had made. She knew exactly what he was doing, reminding her that no matter how far she'd come, he could still control the story. And for the first time in months, she felt the sting of doubt. Was she strong enough to win this war? Or had Adrian just reminded the city why she'd been so easy to replace? The morning after the Winter Heaven Gala, New York's gossip machine roared to life. By 9 a.m., the city's social blogs and digital tabloids were flooded with photos from the event. One image dominated the headlines. Adrian Hale, arm wrapped around Sienna, standing next to Nicholas Grant and Madeline Archer. The captions were as predictable as they were infuriating. Adrian Hale and new flame outshine ex-wife at gala. Grant linked to mystery woman, identified as Hale's former spouse. The tone varied, but the implication was the same. Adrian was still the prize, Madeline still the afterthought. Madeline scrolled through the coverage over coffee in Nicholas's penthouse kitchen. The city skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but she barely saw it. Her phone buzzed nonstop with texts, some sympathetic, some nosy, a few openly fishing for gossip. Nicholas emerged from his study, jacket off, sleeves rolled. He carried 2 mugs and set one in front of her. "Morning fuel." "Thanks," she said, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. "I saw the headlines," he said. "Of course you did. They're everywhere." Nicholas sat across from her, leaning forward on his elbows. "If you want, I can make a few calls. Get those stories rewritten, or pulled." She shook her head. "No, that would make it look like we're hiding something, which we're not." His gaze softened. "Then maybe it's time we stop hiding the truth." She looked up at him. "You mean?" "I mean," he said, "we make it clear who you are, what you've built, and what we are to each other. On our terms." For months, they'd kept their relationship private, both valuing the quiet space they'd created away from public scrutiny. But after last night, Madeline realized silence only allowed other people to tell her story for her. She took a deep breath. "Let's do it." Nicholas's answering smile was small but certain. "I'll set it up." By that afternoon, his publicist had arranged an exclusive interview with the Manhattan Journal, the city's most respected lifestyle magazine. Not a gossip rag. Something with credibility. The interview would be paired with an official engagement announcement and a professional photo shoot. The shoot was scheduled for the following day at Nicholas's townhouse in the West Village. When Madeline arrived, the production team was already setting up. Soft lighting, neutral backdrops, fresh flowers and elegant arrangements. She wore a white silk blouse and tailored trousers for the first set of photos, then changed into a sleek navy dress for the second. Nicholas joined her for the final shots, standing beside her with a hand resting lightly on her back. There was no excessive posing, no contrived intimacy, just 2 people who looked entirely comfortable together. During the interview, the journalist asked about her career. "I started in interior architecture," Madeline explained, "and over the past 2 years I've grown my own design firm. We specialize in residential projects with a focus on creating spaces that feel personal and lived in, not just beautiful." "And how did you and Mr. Grant meet?" She smiled. "Through a project. We found we worked well together. The rest happened naturally." When the topic of Adrian inevitably surfaced, she didn't flinch. "My past doesn't define me. I'm proud of the life I've built since then and of the people I choose to share it with." The interview lasted just under an hour. By the end, Madeline felt lighter, as though she'd reclaimed something she hadn't realized she'd lost. 2 days later, the feature went live online. The headline was simple: Nicholas Grant, engaged to acclaimed designer Madeline Archer. The accompanying photos were striking. Madeline poised and radiant, like Nicholas looking at her with quiet pride. The article highlighted her career achievements, her philanthropic work, and her upcoming projects. Nicholas was mentioned not as her rescuer, but as her partner. The response was immediate. Congratulatory messages poured in from former colleagues, clients, and even people she hadn't spoken to in years. Social media lit up with admiration for her elegance and resilience. And then, inevitably, Adrian called. She let it go to voicemail. The message he left was terse. "Congratulations. Guess you've been busy. We should talk." She didn't return the call. Instead, she focused on the gala scheduled for that weekend, the Harrington Foundation Ball, one of the city's most exclusive events. Adrian and Sienna would be there. So would Nicholas. And now, the entire guest list would be arriving with fresh knowledge of exactly who Madeline was and who she was engaged to. The night of the ball, Nicholas's car pulled up to the entrance of the Grand Regent Hotel. Photographers lined the velvet ropes, their flashes strobing against the dark winter sky. Madeline stepped out first in a floor-length silver gown that caught the light with every movement. Her hair was swept into a soft chignon, diamond earrings catching the glow from the chandeliers spilling out of the lobby. Nicholas followed, offering his hand as they walked together past the cameras. Questions were shouted. "When's the wedding? Where did you meet?" But they kept moving, smiles calm, unhurried. Inside, the atmosphere was much like the Winter Haven Gala, but tonight the attention was different. People approached with genuine congratulations, not veiled curiosity. Adrian spotted them almost immediately. He was standing near the stage, a glass of scotch in hand. Sienna was beside him, but her smile looked strained. When their eyes met, Adrian's expression tightened, just for a second, before he smoothed it over with a polite nod. Madeline returned the nod, nothing more. She didn't need to prove anything tonight, because the truth was already out there. And for the first time since their divorce, Adrian Hale was no longer in control of her story. If the Winter Haven Gala had been the scene of her quiet resilience, the Harrington Foundation Ball would become the stage for her full transformation. In the days leading up to it, Madeline poured herself into preparation, not out of vanity, but with the same precision she used to plan a major design project. Every element mattered: the gown, the accessories, the way she would carry herself through a room full of people who had once looked past her. She chose a custom gown from a designer who understood her philosophy: elegance over excess. The dress was deep sapphire silk, cut to skim her figure without clinging, the neckline a clean architectural line that framed her collarbones. The back swept low, revealing just enough skin to intrigue without crossing into spectacle. Her hair was styled into soft waves that framed her face. Makeup kept luminous and understated, the kind that whispered confidence instead of shouting for attention. Around her wrist, she wore a vintage diamond bracelet, her grandmother's, which had survived 2 generations without losing its sparkle. But the true change wasn't in what she wore. It was in how she moved. The woman who entered the Grand Regent that night wasn't a supporting character in anyone else's story. She was the author now. From the moment she stepped out of Nicholas's car, the energy shifted. Photographers didn't just take her picture. They followed her with their lenses, sensing there was something in her presence worth capturing. The murmurs in the crowd weren't about her being the ex-wife of Adrian Hale anymore. Tonight, she was the fiancée of Nicholas Grant, the acclaimed designer, the woman everyone wanted to meet. Nicholas matched her stride perfectly, his hand steady at her back as they walked into the ballroom. They didn't rush to greet anyone. Instead, they allowed the room to come to them. And it did. The first to approach were fellow designers and art patrons who had followed her career quietly, waiting for the right moment to align themselves with her. Then came philanthropists who had worked with Nicholas, eager to congratulate them both. Every conversation was warm, every introduction deliberate. Madeline noticed the subtle glances across the room, people shifting their attention away from Adrian and Sienna, drawn instead to the quiet gravity of her and Nicholas together. Adrian noticed too. He was by the bar when she finally caught his gaze. His tailored suit was perfect, his smile perfectly practiced, but his eyes, those gave him away. There was a flash of something sharp there, quickly masked. Sienna, resplendent in a gold sequined gown, clung to his arm a little tighter when she saw Nicholas lean in to say something that made Madeline laugh softly. The evening unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Madeline mingled with guests, spoke passionately about her upcoming projects, even discussed a new charity initiative she and Nicholas were co-funding to support emerging designers from underprivileged backgrounds. It wasn't just small talk. It was a statement of who she was now and where she was going. The press took notice. A reporter from the Manhattan Journal approached her mid-evening for a few quotes. "You seem to be having quite a year, Miss Archer," the reporter said. Madeline smiled. "It's been transformative, yes, but I think the best is still ahead." As the night wore on, the energy built toward the charity's main event, a live pledge drive hosted from the stage. Donors were invited to announce their contributions publicly, often competing, good-naturedly, for the largest sum. Adrian predictably made a show of it. When his turn came, he strode to the microphone, Sienna beaming at his side. "The Harrington Foundation does incredible work," he said smoothly. "On behalf of Hale Development, I'm pledging $250,000 tonight." Polite applause followed. Adrian glanced in Madeline's direction, his smirk subtle but unmistakable. Nicholas leaned toward her. "Do you want me to handle this?" She shook her head. "No, this one's mine." When the host opened the floor for more pledges, Madeline rose. Heads turned as she made her way to the stage, her sapphire gown catching the light. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady. "I'm Madeline Archer, founder of Archer Interiors. I'm here not only as a supporter of the Foundation's mission, but as someone who believes in creating opportunities where they don't yet exist." She paused, scanning the room, not rushing, letting the silence work for her. "Tonight, Nicholas Grant and I are pledging $500,000 to the Harrington Foundation, earmarked for scholarships and mentorship programs for young designers who wouldn't otherwise have a chance to step into this world." A collective murmur swept through the crowd, followed by applause. Louder, warmer than what Adrian had received. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment. She didn't look at Adrian, but she didn't need to. She could feel the shift. Back at their table, Nicholas squeezed her hand. "You handled that beautifully." She smiled. "Told you it was mine." The rest of the evening flowed with ease. Madeline felt lighter, more anchored. This wasn't about outshining Adrian. It never had been. It was about standing in her own light, and tonight that light was impossible to ignore. By the time the ball ended, the story had already begun to rewrite itself. The photographers outside didn't just call for Mr. Grant or Miss Archer. They called for them together, and when Madeline glanced back at the ballroom doors, she saw Adrian watching from just inside, his smile gone, his eyes narrowed. Not in triumph, but in recognition. Recognition that the woman he'd once dismissed as replaceable was now untouchable. And the night wasn't even over yet. The Harrington Foundation ball was winding into its final hour, but the air was anything but relaxed. The pledge drive had changed the dynamic of the night. Everyone had felt it. Adrian's usual effortless control had slipped, and now the room buzzed with the aftershocks of Madeline's announcement. Madeline hadn't gone looking for a confrontation. She was perfectly content to enjoy the rest of the evening with Nicholas, basking in the quiet satisfaction of knowing she'd reclaimed her voice. But Adrian was never the type to let someone else have the last word. It happened near the silent auction tables. Guests were making last-minute bids on everything from luxury vacations to rare art. Madeline was studying a framed architectural sketch when she heard his voice behind her. "$500,000, Adrian said lightly. "Impressive. You've come a long way since we were married." She turned slowly, her expression neutral. "And you're still measuring worth in dollar signs." His smile didn't falter, but there was an edge to it now. "I'm just saying, it's easy to make a big splash when someone else is footing the bill." Nicholas, who had been a few steps away, joined them. "If you're implying what I think you are," he said, voice calm but cutting, "I'd reconsider." Quickly, Adrian glanced between them, a glint of challenge in his eyes. "Relax, Grant. I'm just curious how much of this new life is really hers." Madeline met his gaze without flinching. "All of it. Every decision, every project, every achievement. You had nothing to do with any of it." A small crowd had started to form, drawn in by the low hum of tension. Adrian's smirk deepened. "I suppose that includes the engagement too? Or was that just convenient timing?" The bait was obvious, but Madeline didn't take it. Instead, she reached into her clutch and pulled out her phone. With a few taps, she brought up a photo, one the public hadn't seen yet. It was from the night Nicholas proposed, a candid shot taken by a close friend, her hand in his, the sapphire and diamond ring catching the light, both of them laughing. She turned the screen toward Adrian. Convenient timing? No. Perfect timing. And not for the reasons you think. Whispers rippled through the onlookers. Nicholas stepped closer to her, his presence solid at her side. Madeline doesn't need anyone to speak for her, but let me be clear. She's the most capable, resilient, and visionary person I've ever met. And if you think your opinion carries weight here, he glanced deliberately at the people surrounding them. You're in the minority. Adrian's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, a familiar voice from the crowd broke in. Actually, said Eleanor Wexford, one of the city's most influential arts patrons, I think Nicholas is being generous. Madeline has more standing in this room right now than you've had in years. The murmurs grew louder. Adrian's confident facade cracked, just a hair, but enough for those watching closely to see it. Madeline let the silence stretch, the weight of Eleanor's words hanging between them. Then she stepped forward, closing the distance by just enough to make her point. You always thought the worst thing I could do was leave you, she said quietly, so only he and those closest could hear. You were wrong. The worst thing I could do was thrive without you, and I have. The crowd shifted, sensing the final blow. Sienna appeared then, clearly uncomfortable, her hand gripping Adrian's arm. Maybe we should go. But Adrian pulled away, still trying to salvage control. Enjoy it while it lasts, Madeline. Attention fades. She smiled, calm, assured, devastating. Not when it's built on substance. That's why yours always runs out. A few gasps, a few stifled laughs. Someone clapped, though it was quickly muffled. Nicholas slipped his hand into hers. We're done here, he said, his voice meant for her alone. They walked away together, leaving Adrian and Sienna standing alone in the circle of onlookers. The buzz followed them out of the auction area, through the ballroom, and right out into the marble-floored lobby. As they stepped into the cool night air, photographers swarmed. Flashes lit up the dark like fireworks. Madeline, over here. Nicholas, can we get a shot of the ring? They paused just long enough for a few photos. Madeline's hand resting lightly on Nicholas's chest, the ring sparkling under the streetlights. The moment the car door closed behind them, she exhaled slowly. Feel better? Nicholas asked. She glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. Better than I have in years. He reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. That's because tonight wasn't just about him. It was about you, showing everyone and yourself exactly who you are now. She leaned back against the seat, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. Then I think it's safe to say, mission accomplished. And somewhere behind them, in a gilded ballroom full of people who'd just witnessed his defeat, Adrian Hale was realizing that for the first time in his life, he'd been outplayed. The following week unfolded like the slow bloom of a flower Madeline had planted years ago without knowing it. The morning after the Harrington Foundation ball, the city's media didn't focus on Adrian Hale or Sienna Reed. Every major outlet, from the Manhattan Journal to the national networks, featured Madeline and Nicholas. Headlines described them as New York's power couple and the future of philanthropy in design. The photo of Madeline at the microphone, announcing their $500,000 pledge, was everywhere. Her inbox overflowed, not with gossip or pity, but with opportunity. Designers she admired wanted to collaborate. Clients she'd once only dreamed of working with reached out. Even her old firm sent a note of congratulations, the tone unexpectedly warm. She read each message carefully, responding with gratitude, never forgetting how far she'd come from the woman who once doubted if she could survive without Adrian. Nicholas noticed the change too. You've been smiling in your sleep, he teased one morning over coffee. That's because I finally feel like I'm living my own life, she replied, meaning every word. But there was still one loose end she knew she had to tie off, not for the public, but for herself. She called Adrian. When he answered, his voice was cautious. Madeline, I'm not calling to fight, she said simply. I just want you to know, whatever we were, whatever we went through, it's over. Completely. I don't need your approval, your acknowledgement, or your attention. And I don't care what you tell people about me anymore, because the only story that matters is the one I'm living. There was a long silence on the other end. Then, quietly, I guess I underestimated you. You did, she said, but that's not my burden to carry anymore. She hung up without waiting for a response. The closure was quiet, Almost anticlimactic, but it was enough. 2 months later, spring unfurled across the city. Madeline's firm launched its new mentorship program for young designers, funded in part by the pledge from the Harrington Ball. The first group of scholarship recipients arrived at her studio one bright morning, their faces alight with possibility. She walked them through the open-plan space, showing them workstations, the materials library, the mood boards in progress for upcoming projects. The energy was electric, the kind she'd always wanted her work to inspire. "This program exists because someone once tried to make me feel small," she told them, "and I decided to prove, to myself, not to them, that I was bigger than that." She didn't mention Adrian's name. She didn't need to. That evening, she and Nicholas attended a small gathering at the home of one of his longtime friends, a dinner overlooking the Hudson River. It wasn't a gala, there were no photographers, just good food, real conversation, and the kind of laughter that made the hours disappear. At one point, Nicholas pulled her aside to the terrace. The city lights glittered in the distance, the river catching their reflection. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the wedding." She smiled. "Oh? I don't want it to be about making a statement to anyone else, just us, our people, the ones who matter." Madeline felt a warmth spread through her. "I wouldn't have it any other way." They set a date for late summer, a ceremony in a restored garden estate upstate, far from the flashbulbs of the city. When the day came, the air was filled with the scent of roses and the sound of laughter. Her dress was simple, elegant. Nicholas waited for her at the end of an aisle lined with wildflowers. As she walked toward him, there was no thought of the past, no shadow of what had been, only the bright, unwavering certainty of what was to come. When they said their vows, it wasn't about promising perfection. It was about promising truth, respect, and partnership. Afterward, as the sun set in streaks of gold and crimson, Nicholas took her hand. "You know," he said softly, "there was never a version of this story where you didn't win." She laughed, leaning into him. "Maybe. But I had to live it to believe it." From that day forward, Madeline's life moved in a direction she had once only imagined. Her business thriving, her marriage a true partnership, her sense of self unshakable. She saw Adrian occasionally in the society pages, still making appearances, still chasing relevance. But the sight of his name no longer sparked anything in her. Not anger, not sadness, just indifference. And in the quiet moments, mornings with coffee on the balcony, evenings designing a new space for a client who trusted her completely, she understood the truth. Strength wasn't born from the fight with Adrian. It came from deciding she didn't need the fight at all. And for every woman who had been told she was replaceable, she carried the same message. You are more than the worst thing someone ever made you feel. The city would always remember the night she walked into the Winter Haven Gala and changed the story. But Madeline would remember something even more important. The night she walked into her own life and refused to ever walk back out. All right, my wonderful friends, so that's how our story comes to a close. And if you're still here with me right now, it means something in this journey touched your heart in its own quiet way. Maybe it reminded you that no one has the power to define your worth but you. The Stoics used to say, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. Madeline's story is proof of that. She didn't win by fighting harder. She won by building a life so strong, no one could tear it down. So whatever your past holds, remember, you are more than what happened to you. If this story spoke to you, give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you're subscribed so we can keep walking these journeys together. After all, every ending is just the start of another chapter.